Hello and welcome to this event on putting LGBTI research into action around the world. We'll be discussing how data and advocacy can work together to advance LGBTI rights globally and highlight one particular use of research with new public opinion data on attitudes towards transgender people and rights. I'm Ari Shah. I'm Director of International Programs at the Williams Institute. And for those who may not know us, the Williams Institute is a research center based at the University of California, Los Angeles School of Law, focused on LGBTI law and public policy. This event is part of the Williams Institute's 20th anniversary celebration series. And for those interested, our virtual gala will be held on June 9th at 5 p.m. Pacific. And of course, we would love for any and all of you who are interested to come celebrate with us. The Williams Institute was founded 20 years ago to ensure that facts and evidence, not myths and stereotypes, are what are used to shape law and public policy that impact LGBTI people. And we wanted to take this opportunity on the occasion of our anniversary to reflect on the importance of data for advancing LGBTI rights globally. As you know, data is critical to understanding how LGBTI people are impacted, often disproportionately, by exclusion in areas such as healthcare, employment, education, housing, and access to justice. And data can shed light on individual and community needs and help inform evidence-based solutions. And yet only 4 cents of every dollar spent on global LGBTI issues goes to research. This is surely a huge topic that could fill many conferences, but we hope this is just part of an ongoing conversation about the need for and use of data to advance LGBTI rights. We have an incredible esteemed panel, and I'd like to jump right in so that we can hear from these experts on how data shapes and supports activism, and likewise how advocacy can and should inform research priorities. I'm delighted to welcome, as I said, this truly remarkable panel. We have Victor Madrigal-Borloz, UN independent expert on protection against violence and discrimination based on sexual orientation and gender identity. Jessica Stern, Executive Director of Outright Action International. Liberty Matthyse, Executive Director of Gender DynamiX. Letlhogonolo Mokgoroane, who is patient with my mispronunciation of his name, is a South African lawyer and co-author of the report on public opinion on transgender rights in South Africa. Ivana Krstic, Professor of Law at the University of Belgrade and co-author of the report Public Opinion on Transgender Rights in Serbia. Cristiano Ronzelovich, Executive Director of XY Spectrum. And Winston Luhur, Research Assistant at the Williams Institute and the project manager for our series on global public opinion towards transgender rights. We have a lot to get through, but we of course welcome your questions and we'll do our best to cover as much as possible. So please feel free to put any questions in the Q&A box. Victor, I'd love to begin with you. Your position as UN independent expert on SOGI is interesting in that it straddles to some extent both policymaking at the UN and activism. And I was wondering if you can start by talking a bit about how data shapes your work as independent expert and how you see data being used by policymakers and other state actors with whom you engage.
Thank you very much, Ari, for that question. And of course, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone. Thank you so much to the Williams Institute, and I'm delighted, and it's a true privilege to join this celebration. I think that information, data, and evidence is very obviously what made my mandate possible. We must remember that before the first reports issued on the challenges faced by LGBT people around the world by the Office of the High Commissioner in 2011 and 2017, these discussions were a reflection of how discussions are shaped by prejudice and stigma, basically depending very heavily on opinion and very often on the personal prejudice and opinion of the particular policymakers that were participating in the discussion at that very moment. And it was the issuance of those two reports, the beginning of the presentation of evidence by the Office of the High Commissioner that persuaded a critical mass of states that actually the creation of the mandate was necessary to the objective of, on one hand, providing visibility to the problematic, to the challenges, to the way that LGBT persons face violence and discrimination around the world every day. And on the other hand, how does that visibility, how does that evidence actually inform public policy once it is made available to different policymakers around the globe? So I think in the very existence of the mandate that I have, Ari, you will see a reflection of how evidence actually moves forward the creation of institutions and institutionalities to the service, of course, of furthering the work of addressing violence and discrimination and eventually eradicating it.
Are there particular SOGI-related issues or policy areas that have been most impacted in your work by the advent of new data, sort of in addition to the establishment of this particular institution?
Well, I would say it's very obvious to me that there are, in the two great chapters of the mandate's scope, there are immediate impacts of the availability of data. Firstly, in relation to violence, I can share with you what my experience was in 2009 when we started working on this issue at the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights. We knew at the Commission that there were claims about the pervasive and extremely worrisome state of violence against trans women in the Americas at that stage. But when we looked into the matter, we realized that zero evidence was available, zero data was available in relation to this issue. And very, very quickly we found out that the reason why this was so is that justice operators, from the police to the prosecution to the court system, registered the killing of trans women as killings of men, thereby rendering completely invisible to the purpose of public policy making this significant or a cause of human rights violations. And we have seen the difference that the availability of data mostly gathered by civil society in the continent has produced in relation to this. For example, we now have data to know that in a horrifying way, there is a trans woman killed every day in Brazil. We know this, and therefore it is possible for all of the elements in the system to begin to put pressure so that this situation is addressed. That's a very telling example when you see violence, and it reflects all along the cycles and spirals of violence that affect LGBT people around the world. But then you go on to discrimination issues. And of course, these are very closely interconnected, violence being an extreme form of discrimination and discrimination being at the root of every form of violence. But if you look at the sectoral analysis that many stakeholders in the system do, including, of course, my mandate, the work on how the lived realities of LGBT people can be reflected on data when it comes to education, employment, housing, and health. For example, just to give you 4 examples, it makes an immediate difference to understand the rate in which LGBT pupils abandon primary, secondary, and other levels of education and how it impacts their accessibility to health services, their ability to interact with the employment sector, and their relationship with informal and formal employment. And finally, how it has created a situation that is a non-level playing field coming into the COVID-19 pandemic, where we know now we have some evidence where that is being gathered about the situation of structural inequality in which LGBT people all around the world came to the pandemic. All of those elements, Ari, all of those elements are being fed substantially by the production of evidence. You said it in your introduction. Evidence and the availability of evidence is the antonym of prejudice and stigma, and particularly important in an era such as the one that we're living through, where fake news and acting on prejudice is something that we need to work against on our human rights-based approach.
Are there particular needs in terms of data, or really opportunities that you see for data to advance policy at the international level through your work?
Well, the idea of my report on data, which was issued in 2019, and to which the Williams Institute and you yourself, Harry, as well as so many of the distinguished colleagues in this panel contributed. The idea of that report was to actually provide a set of guidelines to states so that they could fulfill their obligation of due diligence when actually interacting with data. In my view, there is robust evidence within international human rights law to establish a connection between the duty of states to gather data to inform their public policy on facts and the discharge of their due diligence obligation. Now, of course, data gathering and management needs to fulfill certain standards. And we have significant challenges all around the world. One of the examples that I always use and that I would like for us to always bear in mind is it's very difficult to gather data that has integrity in the 69 countries that maintain criminalization of sexual orientation. Because how do you ask people about the way their families are conformed, who they live with, what their health concerns are, if you actually have at the same time a system in which their lived experiences that they're going to disclose are criminalized? And this is one of the big challenges that I see in the world that we live in, is that no answer can be blanket because they need to be textured. How do you deal also with contexts that change with great volatility? I once was talking to an organization operating in the Horn of Africa, and they explained to me how they had to destroy 25 years of data that they had gathered on health outcomes when the law changed and it became once again criminalized to actually maintain information that would relate to homosexuality and forms of gender identity. Or in the more recent and perhaps familiar to you history, how do you ask trans people who serve in the military to disclose when shifts in public policy can suddenly act to their detriment based on political changes? All of these are the great challenges that we face in relation to data. The other one, Ari, just to be very succinct, is no state, not one single state in the world fulfills to a complete degree their obligation to gather data systematically and to manage it and preserve it according to the guidelines that I was able to identify. Where data is being gathered, it is gathered in a fragmented way. It is gathered in a way that is subject to political volatility without exception. And most areas around the world, it is being gathered exclusively by civil society, and therefore subject to cycles of vulnerability because of financing and limitations in relation to time and space. So the challenges are great. What are the opportunities? The opportunities is that we see the impact when evidence-based approaches are implemented. And again, I will go back to the political persuasion around the renewal of the mandate of the independent expert. As you know, this mandate was discussed, the creation of the mandate was discussed on the basis of prejudice in 2016. When the renewal came about, a significant number of states which had been against the creation of the mandate voted for the continuation, and consistently they said that the reason why they had done so is because of the evidence that had been made available to them and which comes from so many organizations around this call today, which comes from you and is persuading states of the fact that violence and discrimination is real, that LGBT people exist everywhere, and that they must be part of the design and the management of data that concerns them.
Thanks, Victor. Jessica Stern from Outright wasn't able to join us live today, but I recently had the chance to speak with her about this topic, and I'd like to just play a clip from that conversation. I began by asking her how data links to advocacy strategies at Outright.
Our community is experiencing. How do we get those with power to listen to us and take our community's experiences seriously? And a critical part of the answer is we produce data to substantiate our claims. Credible, aggregated data that says this is not a one-off incident. This amounts to a pattern of systematic human rights violations. This amounts to the failure of the rule of law. And so I would say at Outright, we have a symbiotic relationship between the research we undertake and the advocacy strategies we pursue, because it's very hard to advocate to decriminalize homosexuality or abolish so-called cross-dressing laws or to ban conversion practices if you don't have data to show the way those laws harm people. And so research, whether it's by us or by wonderful partners like the Williams Institute, literally informs everything that we do.
And, you know, talking about how data is important to, you know, influence decision makers or to make more persuasive cases, have you found that there are certain kinds of data or ways of using data that are, you know, more or less effective in trying to have an impact on law and policy?
That's actually a hard question, because all credible data is useful, but there's different kinds of data that you need for different kinds of advocacy targets. So I just did an interview this morning, and the thrust of that interview was actually in the value of strategic use of personal testimonials. And
Did we lose that, Matthew? We'll try to get that back. You know, one of the other questions that I had asked Jessica about was sort of how they use public opinion data and data on attitudes towards LGBTI people, which is something that the Williams Institute has you know, tried to develop in our work over the years. And we wanted to take this as a chance to segue to look more closely at one particular type of data and how that is and can be used to advance LGBTI rights globally, and that's public opinion towards transgender rights, and consider what kinds of opportunities or challenges this presents for advocacy. Winston, Luhur, my colleague at the Williams Institute, you're the project manager for this series at the Williams Institute, and I was hoping that you could tell us a bit about this project's origins before we get to some of the findings from South Africa and Serbia.
Sure, thank you, Ari. Matthew, if you don't mind bringing up my slides. I think you have a I guess I can just start talking a bit about the context. This project was initiated in around 2016 originally as a partnership between Ipsos, a global marketing firm, and BuzzFeed News, who many of you may know as one of the largest media organizations in the United States. as part of their 23-country survey around transgender rights and beliefs around transgender people. And Williams Institute was roped in as one of the consultants and collaborator in that project. Oh, thanks, Matthew. So next slide. Can you go back? Thanks. So BuzzFeed, Ipsos, and us released 3 separate reports on our respective websites with differing levels of analysis, where Ipsos and BuzzFeed released more top-line kind of reports, while we, with our statistician and our previous director of international programs and the previous project manager, release a more in-depth look, with more advanced statistical analysis on the actual data set. Our project manager then took that data to an ILGA conference in Poland and did a country-specific analysis for Poland, and to great fanfare. And that made us realize the value in perhaps continuing this project in a more per-country analysis basis. And when Ipsos presented us with the 2017 data, we took their offer and we did analysis for so far 9 countries. So next slide. So the 2017 survey, just to give an overview of how it's recruited and who's in that survey. So these are respondents ages 16 to 64 or 18 to 64 in US and Canada, with access to internet and ability to read English in several countries, or ability to read their local language. And this is selected randomly from Ipsos' own panel of 4.7 million survey participants in 47 countries. And this survey in particular is part of their monthly Ipsos Global Advisor Survey, which is mostly a marketing survey, but they were able to slot this particular set of questions in for the 2017 version. And this particular survey is conducted between October 24th and November 7th of 2017, which yielded a total of 19,747 adults in 27 countries, around 500 to 1,000 respondents in each country. Of these 27 countries, we consider 16 countries have a high enough internet penetration rate of 60% or more. And these are 16 countries, which include several countries in Latin America, Europe, Asia, and North America, while 11 countries are considered not nationally representative, and Ipsos consider them more representative or of a more upper deck consumer person. So next slide. So what is being asked in this survey, aside from demographics, of course, we ask about familiarity with transgender people. So this is, for example, do you have friends or family who are transgender? Do you know of acquaintances who are transgender? Or conversely, do you rarely encounter transgender people, or do you not know of any transgender people? And secondly, there are questions around attitudes towards transgender rights, including gender, from whether government should protect them from discrimination. Should transgender people be allowed to use bathrooms according to their gender identity, and whether they should be allowed to undergo gender affirming surgery. Lastly, there are also a barrage of questions around beliefs around transgender people, including how they are perceived to be positioned inside their society. This includes beliefs around whether transgender people are committing a sin, or whether they have a mental illness, whether they have a physical disability, whether they're violating traditions of their culture, and also whether they think society is becoming more tolerant to transgender people, or conversely, whether their society and what their government has allowed transgender people too far. And so I'll just continue with, so far we have released 5 countries: United States, South Korea, Malaysia, Mexico, and Turkey. And upcoming reports include Serbia and South Africa, which is hopefully coming sometime next month, and also China and Peru, which is also coming in this sometime in a couple months. And next slide. So that's it for me. Let's continue to South Africa.
Thanks, Winston. That's a really helpful overview of the project and sort of the approach to data collection that we used. Liberty, I know that you have to leave us early, so we'll go to you first before we talk about sort of the specific findings of the South Africa report. But I wonder if you could talk a bit, especially as a leading trans rights activist in South Africa, how does data like this sort of public opinion data inform your activism and strategies?
Greetings, everyone, and thank you, Ari, for the concession made. So from our end, data is critical for evidence-based advocacy in the country. What we know is that we don't have enough data and information that exists about trans and gender diverse persons within this particular context. And of course, that undermines the extent to which we can engage in advocacy agendas from an evidence-based vantage point. In addition to that, we also know that knowledge about the community is predominantly also produced by civil society organizations. And where we are producing knowledge about the community, it is questioned, the legitimacy thereof is questioned. And of course, because that it's not considered empirical by policymakers and decision makers. At the same time, we note that researchers and research institutions often undertake research agendas that involve us, and particularly within this region and within this country, that often takes the form of HIV biomedical type of research being conducted towards containing the HIV pandemic within the region. And so on the one side, that's useful, but it is also harmful, as in many regards, our issues, our concerns are conflated with, and particularly that of trans women, are conflated with that of MSM persons or deemed persons. And then, of course, in many regards, in these research agendas, we are relegated to only being data subjects and not being able to equally participate within the conceptualization and, of course, implementation of research projects. And that is a concern for us. But in looking further, in order for us to develop priorities and find the most effective strategies, it is important to understand both the needs of trans and gender diverse persons in conjunction with broader social and political realities. The current research project that you embarked on as the Williams Institute is valuable as it provides insights into a particular demographic in South African society. It was indeed heartening to note that 57% of the sample consisted of young people between the ages of 16 years and 34 years. And given the ideological tensions that seems to be emerging and that exists between sex and gender-based rights activism and the anti-gender ideology movement, data on public opinion matters as it provides a baseline for determining the current and also possible future trajectory of transgender and diverse women's rights within this particular context. The report highlights that transgender visibility matters, as familiarity or knowledge about transgender persons is key to driving social inclusion. This means that from a programming perspective, we need to maintain and upskill programs that positively portray trans and gender diverse persons as part of families and communities and people who are great contributors to positively building society. In looking at the attitudes towards transgender persons, I think it is clear that interventions on how to educate society around the reconceptualization of things such as gender segregated public spaces, such as toilets, is critical. However, in doing so, we must be aware of competing interests within this particular context. And those competing interests is, on the one end, the need for trans and gender diverse persons to have access to spaces within the public domain that's gender segregated. And on the other end, in the context of toilets, the concerns that cisgender women hold around safety and security concerns in a country that is rampant, that has a rampant rape and, of course, gender-based violence culture. For us, ultimately, this data is very much useful for advocacy as it provides evidence that public support exists for further realization of human rights for transgender persons. This is useful as it highlights that South Africa is diverse and in some regards, not as hostile to the community. This may indeed be indicative of existing space for civil society to advance work around resource allocation for things such as gender-affirming healthcare and reforming gender recognition law on the basis of depathologization and gender self-determination. It may also be indicative that the anti-gender ideology movement in the country, though emerging and strong, still lacks significant public support. This signals an opportune time to advance more persuasive, assertive, and collective advocacy agendas to further embed human rights for the community in the legislative framework so that it cannot easily be rolled back. And so perhaps lastly from my end, and this is perhaps on a little bit of a critical note, the research findings are based on a very particular demographic that predominantly locates themselves within the medium to high level of education and monthly household income bracket. These statistics are not necessarily reflective of the true reality of South Africa's huge wealth and income inequality gap, and that the majority of the population is living in poverty. This class dynamic needs to perhaps be questioned because it may paint a distorted picture of the true nature of social attitudes in the population, particularly when it comes to rural, less resourced and equipped poorer communities within the country where a large majority of the country resides. And of course, the reason why I'm saying this is that violence and hate crimes and brutal killings of queer people within this country, despite the progressive laws and policies that we have in place, remains rife. And with the hope of not blackwashing hate crimes, this is indicative of multiple worlds and realities that exist within our country context, where freedom and violence and social inclusion remains defined by issues such as race, class, gender identity, sex, and geographical location. And I think those are important considerations that we need to take into account when shaping advocacy agendas in lieu of pre-existing research that has been conducted, being able to identify what further gaps do we need to look at in order to complement our understanding in order to move forward from an evidence-based vantage point. And so I think for me, those would be some of the reflections that I'm keen on sharing with yourselves at the Williams Institute, but also the broader public that is tuning in. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Liberty. Those were really wonderful points, and I know you have to go, so thank you again for taking the time to share with us. Letlhogonolo, I was hoping that you could speak to, as a co-author of the report, but also as an activist yourself, sort of what you found to be some of the key findings from the South Africa data, and also just reflect on what this means for, or potentially means for your own advocacy and the use of data and the work that you do.
Thank you so much, Ari. Hi, everyone. I firstly want to begin, I think that this conversation is really important because it's happening at a particular time and a particular moment in South Africa. As many of you may know, there has been a lot of homophobic violence and transphobic violence in South Africa. And in the span of like the last month, probably about 10 people have died to alleged hate crimes. And so I think that this discussion and this report comes at a very crucial time because it allows us to think about the social attitudes and how these attitudes sort of make trans people's lives better and make queer people's life more broadly better. What was really illuminating for me about the report and the findings in the report was that at least about 72% of the participants had agreed that trans people deserved rights and deserved to be protected from discrimination. And, this is largely congruent with where we find ourselves as South Africa as this, a beacon for queer utopia in Africa. So you would find that people, at least from that perspective, believe that these people have rights in terms of the Constitution. And what was then further, I think, illuminating was also that more and more people, like 62% of the participants were agreed that trans people could serve in the military, could adopt, and could have children. And so in many ways, you thought that, like, you know, it would be a little bit more progressive. And you were happy that at least these people are like, okay, so they are accepting that trans people can have families and trans people can serve in the military. Despite all of that, though, 46.7% of the respondents agreed or stated that trans people were violating culture and tradition. And I think that's really important for South Africa, because we're a country that is rich in diversity in terms of culture. So you would find, as Liberty has indicated, that, you know, most of the people may come from rural areas and may want to still hold on to their cultures and their traditions. And what does this 47.5% of the people who believe that they're violating their culture means for the lives and the realities of those people who live in these rural areas? So for me, it speaks about the safety of these people. So if you are in a home where your family may have participated in the survey and say that this is against culture and tradition, what does that mean for your personhood and for your ability to live in that environment? And then I think also another slight majority of people, which is 50.1% in the survey, also said that they were worried to expose their children to trans people. And so what does that mean for trans children? What does that mean for trans children? Access to healthcare, access to education, access to just having a childhood when you have a trans child. Because these parents are saying that, one, I don't want my child to be exposed to trans people. And more generally, that means I don't want my child to be exposed to a trans kid. So what happens in the situation where one of the parents in this survey takes their child to a kindergarten and there's a trans child who's there? What about that trans child livelihood and personhood? And then I think a really interesting finding was that 72% of the respondents believe that trans people should be protected from discrimination, which I've said, but there also was a large 47.5% believe that trans people should not be using bathrooms that align with their gender identity. Now, that's really crucial. There's an author, Nigel Patel, who's written a really useful articles about thinking about bathrooms and systems, you know, as in cis and then stems, as in the systems that cis people uphold and how they impact trans people. Because often what you find is that when you don't, the bathroom discussion in South Africa is very important, because it means that often people, the bathroom that will be created for gender non-conforming people and trans people would be a bathroom that's like down the corridor or 4 floors down. And so there's an issue about access. And there's also a large conversation about, like, sort of, as Liberty was saying, what is the impact of race, what is the impact of class, and what is the impact of gender identity and gender expression? So I found that the report starts to get a conversation going about trans rights in South Africa. And empirical evidence is always useful, because policymakers often tell us as activists, but where's the data? You know, or where are you getting this? So I think that this allows us to, you know, sort of think of creative ways of saying, well, we have about 15 trans people who've passed away. You can't say that there isn't an anti-trans agenda happening in this country. So I think that the report from that perspective is really helpful for us to begin thinking about how we can use this type of data in order to supplement and complement our human rights work.
Thank you. I'd like to turn to Ivana just as a point of comparison to think about the data from the Serbia poll as well. Matthyse, if you don't mind sharing her slides. Thanks.
Thank you. First of all, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Thank you for the invitation to present the report for Serbia. It's a real pleasure being here today, although virtually. Before I go and explain a little bit in more detail about some important data from this report, I would like to give you a background on the situation in Serbia, which in a way reflects through this data received in this report. So next slide, please. What we can see in Serbia in the past 15 years is that we have some positive and some negative trends concerning LGBTI people. First of all, Serbia is since 2012 a candidate country to join the EU, and that pressure which comes from the EU on that path also influences legal reforms. First of all, constitution was adopted in 2006 and introduced anti-discrimination provision. And also a very comprehensive law on anti-discrimination was adopted in 2009, providing different measures for prevention and protection from discrimination. In 2011, another significant thing happened in Serbia in a way that the mandatory national health insurance was extended to cover a significant part of costs for those who underwent the surgery. And also in 2018, a legal basis was introduced for changing data in birth register and issuing new personal documents. However, all the time and since the past 15 years continuously with all these positive reforms, we have a very tricky situation with LGBTI people in a way that they are all the time they are facing with a lack of information in terms of their access to rights, with inconsistent practice by state authorities, which is also part of a misinterpretation of this legal background that we have. Misinformation also provided by health professionals, and also they're exposed to stigmatization, discrimination, violence, hate speech, and also hate crimes. The main policy document, which is anti-discrimination strategy with its action plan, was expired in 2018 and the new one was not adopted. Also at the same time, we have for a long period of time discussion on introduction of law on gender identity and rights of intersex persons, and also the law on registered partnerships. But what we see in a discussion is that we have many parts of our society, including some public figures, church, and also some traditional communities who are arguing that this law is not necessary and that it is against some Serbian values. And also at the same time, very important is to underline that no steps were taken to support, help, or depathologize trans people in Serbia, as we know that transgender no longer classifies as mental illness. And this background is very much reflected in data that we received from this report. So please, next slide. So what are the main findings of this survey? So we can go to next slide. First of all, it is important to underline that Serbia is the only country among 27 countries covered by this research where no respondents were identified as transgender. And also at the same time, we have a great majority of respondents, even 84.3%, which said that they don't know any trans person personally. What does it mean? It means that it reflects their social exclusion in our society. Also, very tricky information is that younger people, especially those aged from 16 to 34, they are less in favor of some rights which were identified by, which were covered by this report. Then, for example, those who are aged from 50 to 64. And also we have some other reports showing that younger people in Serbia are more conservative than older ones. When we speak about discrimination and protection from discrimination, it is very important to underline that almost 70% of respondents agree that Serbia is becoming more tolerant when it comes to transgender people. But at the same time, we have less or only 60% of those which agreed that they should be protected from discrimination. When we compare this data with some other reports, especially those, for example, which were which were conducted by the Commissioner for Protection of Equality as independent body, we see that mostly and usually respondents are much more in favor of protection for discrimination when we speak in more general terms. Also, another important information is that we have 30%, almost 1/3 of respondents which believe that Serbia has gone too far in allowing transgender people. And at the same time, we have almost 1/2 of respondents who believe that Serbia should do more to protect transgender people. So next slide, please. When it comes to the attitude towards transgender people, we also see that we have a significant number of those respondents who believe that transgender people are not a natural occurrence or that they committed a sin. And also we have that almost 45% of those who respondents agree that they have mental illness, or 30% that they have some kind of form of physical disability, which is still a very high result. And at the same time, with this attitude, we have almost 30% of those who agreed that those people have a very special place in our society. At the same time, a very high number, half of respondents believe that, and they worry about exposing children to transgender people, and also the same number of those believing that those people are violating Serbian culture and tradition. And when it comes to the rights which belong to trans people, we have majority, or 64.2%, which agreed that they should be allowed to have gender affirming surgery. But in that range of those issues which were covered by this report, we have again a high number of those which disagree that they should be allowed to adopt children, as only 26% agrees with this. So what we can conclude from all these results, we can conclude that Serbia, that we still have conservative values which are shaping our society, which sometimes are good ground for denying rights of transgender people, and that Serbia still has to go a long way before fully accepting well-being and lifestyle of trans people. But more on this issue you will hear from my colleague Cristian Ranđelović. Thank you.
Thanks, Ivana. And Kristian, yes, we'd love to hear from you. You know, as an activist, as someone who is working tirelessly on behalf of trans and intersex persons in Serbia, what kinds of data are critical to your work? How does this type of data around public opinion inform one way or another how you think about your advocacy strategies?
Thank you, Ari, and thank you all for this invitation and possibility to participate. It's very crucial to underline there is no such specific research done for trans people, for community and from community, and the other is like stating any kind of opinion regarding trans. I think this is the first one that I can rely on, and this is the first time that we can include information and include that in our activism, which is very important. Lacking of gender identity law, we have the model of the law, which is not still communicated with, definitely not the parliament, but it's not, it is communicated with the community, but it's crucial to have some kind of a binding on one side law, and the law which will protect transgender people, not just in Serbia. This is very important because Serbia is part of the region which was part of ex-Yugoslavia, and that is also very important because sometimes Serbia is making kind of milestone for other countries, and this is also important for some other countries in the region. From the other perspective, looking for the data regarding trans, we never had any information how many trans identities and trans communities we have in Serbia. This is also one of the stepping stones for community itself, because media is communicating a lot about trans, at least for the last few years. And in those articles, and definitely through academia, we're trying to give the voices to different trans identities and different people, because we are all together in this. This is something that it's not recognized at all. And data, how many and where are those people, are very important, not just, of course, for activism, but for the advocacy, to work on different laws, amendments, and definitely to look and to work on human rights perspective, and to look and to work for protection. As Ivana shared information, there's a lot of violence, discrimination, and pathologization, not just in general public, but in the country on so many levels. Also, there is something which is occurring for, I think, the last few years, just before pandemic started. We don't recognize, and we have problem with trans children because they are there and they're part of community. And we have a lot of problems working with TERFs and this understanding of existence of trans children in general. This is also part which Ivana shared about trans elderly people. We are there, we are existing, and we're living our lives. So those communities are not recognized in trans community itself. So a lot of information should be definitely collected, but we are still working on recognition in general public and in community itself. Trans community is wide, and I hope in some point, some years ahead of us, I hope trans community will unite. That was something that was trying to impose when the research started, to how to recognize trans people in general, not just in Serbia, as I said, but in the region, which is very important because we have some histories, 6 countries, six different, not context is almost the same, like we're almost the same like South Africa, but we have differences, and those differences are not recognized. And collection about problems, issues, realities, testimonies about life, and then from outside opinions and understanding from general public. So those are realities that we're living here in Serbia, and I hope this research and more researches will come so we can work not just on activism as it is, but to make definitely advocacy strategy for trans communities in Serbia and a little bit wider in Balkan region. Thank you.
Kristian, thank you so much. That's really tremendous reflections. We've had a few questions about sort of what kinds of research approaches are best for gathering additional data on issues impacting trans people. And I wonder if you have thoughts, both Kristian, Ivana, and Letlhogonolo, about sort of how you as an activist, how trans communities in South Africa and Serbia can and should be involved in research on these communities.
So I think it's really important for trans people to be the ones who often are leading this type of research. I'm really grateful that a lot of trans organizations in South Africa are ran by trans people, and the program's work is also done by trans people. Because I find that sometimes cis people sort of miss the nuances. You know, there's a whole high level human rights based approach, and this is how we apply. But what about the lived experiences of trans people? And I think that often only trans people are even to give the research what it needs in order to get meaningful data. You know, I find that I know that a trans organization in South Africa called Iranti has, what they've done is that they've developed an app which now is on Play Store, and effectively it's called Mapping the Margins. And what it's trying to do is collect data about hate crimes and violation by trans people. So if you want to report something, you report it using the application. And then I suppose what they'll do is that they will collect the information and then transmit it over to the Department of Correctional Services and Justice and Development in order to say, here's the data we have. We need some form of hate crime legislation that specifically deal with transphobic hate crimes. So I think it's really important to have trans people sort of be part of the team and steer the conversation, because they bring something that cis people may not necessarily be able to bring.
can I add something? Thank you for this. This is the same thing that I'm thinking about, how trans people are not, most of the time, are not included or not definitely leading in those processes, definitely not in researches. But on the other side, we have something which is very crucial for Serbia. We have a medical team which is working a lot with trans community, not just in Serbia, but worldwide. People coming from all around the world in Serbia for definitely for surgery or for medical care. And this is also very important for, as I said, not only for trans people from Serbia, but trans people from the region. And there's kind of network which we are trying to build here. We don't have app. I hope at some point we will have that kind of app to help each other to find what possibility from not just medical centers that we have or medical center that we have, but for all our needs, which can be very, very easy, not just fulfilled, but all our needs, which can be also very easy communicated, not just between each other in Serbia, but the others, so we can invite people or share what we have in Serbia, or definitely be together when people from all around the world are coming to Belgrade for any kind of medical treatment. This is also one level of networking that we can provide. And from that point, I hope it would be great to have definitely research what are the needs. As I said, not only for trans people from Serbia, but definitely trans people from the region, because there are a lot of medical care and there is it's available, and those availabilities are good for us because we can exchange and change the system if it's needed. So that's another level of research that can be definitely done, not, as I said, again, not just for Serbia, but for any other country, not in the Balkan region, but around the world. So we can also, I think, a lot of research include trans community. And I've participated in several of them, but most of them are not driven by trans community, or definitely not only not working just for trans community. And we have few communities. We're not only one community. We have several communities under umbrella of trans. So I think it's very important to have those kind of research to work on the needs, issues, even problems that communities are facing.
We've had a couple of questions as well about which entities are collecting data and how that impacts the extent to which they're received and have an impact on shaping law and policy. Victor, I wonder if you have any thoughts about the challenges of data that are gathered by civil society organizations versus data that is brought in through, for instance, government statistical agencies, and how that, if you see differences in how that's received by policymakers and others that you are working to influence.
Thank you very much, Ari. Yes, I think that we need to take point of departure in the reality of things as they are right now. And as they are right now, the great majority of data sets that are being created around the world are being created by civil society. And they are so because states are not living up to their due diligence responsibility to take evidence-based approaches to public policy in relation to communities, populations, and peoples that need to be rendered visible. To the extreme of absurdity, as you know, in some contexts, there is even flat denial of the existence of LGBT people, or as the distinguished members of this panel were actually reflecting, there's de facto denial by not reflecting existences of certain communities and populations in the data sets that are gathered by the state. So as long as that is the case, I place an onus on states to accept the data that is gathered by civil society. I think it is an imperative that we understand that this data needs to be given consequence. The reality, however, is that, as we know, civil society exercises operate under certain limitations. Projects have a beginning and an end. They have certain funding cycles, and they fall under particular funding mechanisms by donors around the world. And these limitations impact the way this data is gathered. Again, that data gathered by civil society is particularly vulnerable to these types of cycles and limitations. I think that the move should be to ensuring that data is gathered in different venues, and not least the states, by incorporation into different data gathering mechanisms, and hopefully arriving to the incorporation of overall mechanisms such as the census. However, always ensuring that the environment is conducive to the do no harm principle. So dismantling criminalization provisions, dismantling regressive provisions in the law, ensuring the impartiality of data, the depolitization of data is fundamental, and transparency, accountability, and lawful use guarantees. Now, two other elements in relation to this, Ari, that I want to reflect on very quickly. The first one is the distinguished panelists have given great examples as to why we need to ensure the adoption of evidence-based approaches. Discussions that actually seem to get a passionate response from people when they are driven by prejudice, such as bathroom discussions or discussions on sports, are completely changing when you contrast them with evidence. And the impact of this is not minor. In the very United States, where the Williams Institute is located, you know that there's a number of laws being implemented to restrict access to trans people in sports, where, for example, when the lawmakers are asked, they can cite not one single example of why this law is actually necessary, because they can cite not one single example of the actual occurrence. That's what happens when you contrast prejudice with fact. And the other thing, and on this I want to pay tribute to the leadership and significant role played by the Williams Institute in relation to insertion of the ability to work within intersectionality when we work with data that can be disaggregated in relation to different groups, communities, and populations, and the different identities that we all reunite in one body. There is not such a thing as a monolithic identity within the LGBT acronym. We are all significantly crossed by race, by socioeconomic status, by religion, by nationality, by experience of disability, and so on and so forth. The type of approach that the Williams Institute takes is crucial in allowing that texture to come through. And final word, many of the distinguished panelists have spoken about the need to bring trans people. I'm sure we'll speak also for other communities and populations within and without and outside the acronym. But I want to underline that I believe that there's a duty to ensure that trans people's expertise over their own life is acknowledged as expertise and not only as testimony of a lived experience. Very often I see that expertise of trans people is asked, but without acknowledging it as real expertise that needs to be given conditions, including, of course, professional remuneration and so on and so forth. This needs to be the case. Thank you very much, Ari.
Thank you, Victor. I think that's an important point to end on. And I know we just scratched the surface of all of this, so I look forward to many more of these conversations with these esteemed panelists and my colleagues. Just to note to everyone that we'll have the video with Jessica Stern up on YouTube along with the recording of this shortly. Thank you again to all of the incredible panelists for taking the time and for your work on these reports. And thank you to everyone for attending. We'll see you soon.